Hi, I'm Sarit with Sustainability Buzz, and thank you so much for joining us for episode 2, Drink Your Values. Today's going to be a fun one. We're going to talk about sustainable wines, and I've got a very special guest with us today, Mika Bolnash. Mika is the CEO and founder of Wine for the World, a wine import and distribution company that connects sustainable, socially responsible, and artisanal producers with thoughtful and adventurous palates. Mika began her career as an international development professional with a focus on Latin American public health, agriculture, and food security programs. In 2013, she launched a collaborative brand between South Africa's first Black woman winemaker, Ntsiki Biela, and Napa Valley's esteemed Helen Keplinger. In 2014, Mika began to import and distribute socially and environmentally impactful producers from around the world. In 2015, she was recognized by Crain's as one of 10 entrepreneurs changing the way New York does business. In 2020, she was named a 40 under 40 tastemaker by Wine Enthusiast, which is a very big recognition. And for our listeners that don't know, Mika also happens to be my sister. So this is very special for me to speak with her on this platform. Mika, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course.
So, could you tell our listeners a little bit more about Wine for the World, how you came up with the concept, and what makes your wines different from the rest?
Sure. So the story begins for me. As you mentioned, I came from an international development background. I was doing food security and public health, which is now much more understood. Back in the day, I think it was less understood, and agriculture for mostly Latin American initiatives. And I had a wine passion that I was trying to figure out what to do with, how I could use wine to maybe make the world a little bit of a better place. And so I eventually quit my international development job and went to South Africa, where I was curious about winemaking in the post apartheid context. Who was making wine, how it was being made, where it was coming from. And along the way, I met a number of different stakeholders, including one that you mentioned, Ntsiki Biela, who is South Africa's first Black woman winemaker. And I asked her, here I am, I'm this American, I have this idea to maybe use wine for the greater good. Um, what can I do to help you? What do you want to achieve? And she said she really just wanted to start her own winery, her own company. And at the time, she was making wine for a boutique red winery in Stellenbosch, but she wasn't really manifesting her own vision. And she said she wanted to start her own thing. And she told me about the challenges in the wine industry in the US. I think we can all appreciate they're huge. There's so much competition. You go to a store and you're kind of inundated with selection, and there are on the sort of trade side significant barriers to entry. How does a new brand enter into the market? And so to help an emerging winemaker who is super talented without necessarily the capabilities of launching her own brand in the US, we developed a collaborative wine brand called first it was called Keplinger Biela, and that was a mouthful. So we rebranded it to Suo, which is Latin for to stitch or unite. And we launched that in collaboration with Helen Keplinger from Napa Valley. And the two of them made this wine over two vintages, and the sales of that, the ability to make that wine enabled Ntsiki to launch her own company now called Aslina. And if anyone's interested or paying attention to diversity in the wine industry, her name comes up a lot, not only because of her historic nature, but also because her wines are really good.
Yeah.
So as a company, we've grown Wine for the World since evolved to importing and then distributing wines that share our ethos of social and environmental impact. So, oftentimes, this means wines that are made by women winemakers, winemakers of color, winemakers part of the LGBTQ community. Also, on the sustainable side, wines that are sustainable, organic, biodynamic, minimal intervention, wines that have a zero carbon footprint. So really any angle of social or environmental impact are wines, and assuming they're good wines, uh, we're interested in them. And so we represent them in the US market.
That is very interesting. And could you tell me a little bit more, and our listeners, a little bit more about how that first collaboration with Ntsiki and Helen, the impact that it had on the wine industry and on them?
So with Nitsiki, it obviously helped launch her career. I mean, she would have probably launched it regardless. She's a force, but we helped accelerate that and gave her a path for incubating her ideas and developing her brand. And now the U.S. is her largest market by far. We sell
Oh,
out of her wines. We are constantly ordering whatever she can give us, and we're helping her grow and um, quite a lot.
I love her wines. I've had them and they are delicious. And that kind of takes me to my next question, which is you guys have your brand has a social mission behind each bottle. Could you tell us a little bit more about the missions and examples of them?
Sure. So from the social side, I can give you an example. Bosman Family Vineyards in South Africa, they were named Ethical Company of the Year globally. And this is in part, if they do so many wonderful things, not only on the social side, also on the environmental side, but let's start on the social side. So on the social side, they're fair trade, which means, and without going into too much detail because there are different certification bodies in different countries, but in the wine industry, in in terms of South Africa, what it means is that they provide um, obviously living wages, not just minimum wages. They ensure safe environments. They also have a trust, so every sale of every bottle goes towards a trust that the workers decide what to do with that money.
Wow.
So in some cases, they do beautification projects on their gardens. Sometimes in some companies, that means they want to purchase better TVs and and it has different permutations for different companies. In the case of Bossman, not only are fair trade certified, they gave 26% of their company over to their employees.
Wow.
So in a company like Bossman, which is quite robust because they also have other aspects to their business, they're a vine nursery, for example, so they sell cuttings to a lot of other companies in the industry. It's actually quite meaningful, and so they provide homes to all of their workers. They have a school, a retirement home when their employees retire. They provide transportation. It goes on and on and on. They're incredibly thoughtful in their approach, and they recognize that when you build joint ownership in whatever company, it benefits the workers, it also benefits the company, right? Because
Absolutely.
people feel like they do have a vested interest in the success of the company.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. That is so amazing. And I did not know that about, I've had their wines and they're delicious, but I didn't know the thoughtfulness that went behind the brand. And so, speaking of tasting your wines, Wine for the World recently launched their Drink Your Values Wine Club, which is a monthly subscription program where members receive four curated wines each month. And they receive a wine card that explains to the customer about a little bit about each bottle, the winemaking process, the winemakers, how they're sustainable. And so here's an example of April's wine card. I forgive my highlighting. And the theme was centered around Earth Month, Earth Day. And so it was a palette for the planet, a lot of sustainable wines in it. My favorite, Mika, and I know I talked with you about this, and I'm not pronouncing it right, the Tina Katorogos.
That's perfect. So
Oh, it is.
Greek is phonetic, so you sound
Okay.
it out. Tinaktorogos. Perfect.
The label, I couldn't pronounce it based on the label, which is, in the actual language. But this wine, I shared it with some girlfriends and my husband, and we were all blown away. It is by far my favorite white wine. I'm going to hunt that one down moving forward. The other bottles were just exquisite. And then this month's, which I just received a few days ago and I've already delved into, the theme is natural fermentation. And as you guys said in the wine card, it's more festive and fruity and a little funky, which is celebrating the natural fermentation process. It is, and I poured a little bit for us here. And just to show you guys the bottles, so this is the Jovent wine, which I have poured, and you can see on the back the Wine for the World logo. And then here's another bottle, which is the Scions of Sinai. Oops. And this one, Mika will tell us a little bit about these in more depth. And then the last one is the kave, which I'm excited for this one too. And as I said, the fourth one is gone because we've consumed it in my household. So, and one of the things, just before you tell us a little bit about the wines, is that for someone like me, when I go to the wine store to buy my bottle, I just kind of stick with what I know. So I buy the same bottle over and over. It's at a certain price point. It tastes good, but it gets boring. And the truth is, I don't have the skill set or the time to go through and find which wines are sustainable, which have a social mission, and then which taste good. So one thing that I absolutely love about this wine club is that you take that guessing game process out for people. And I'm someone who, I want to speak with my wallet. Purchasing power means a lot to me, and I can feel assured that the wines that I'm supporting are going to a good cause, and they are ensuring environmental awareness and social development, and they're amazing. They're so unique. They're so, I haven't tasted flavors like this. So I'm very excited about the Drink Your Values Wine Club. And just so that people can check before I forget the URL, it's club.winefortheworld.com. And that's with the number 4. And I will be posting the URL for our viewers. But Mika, if you could tell us a little bit more about these wines and how you select the wines each month.
Sure. So I'll start with the selection process. So when we bring on a new producer, we obviously look at their ethos. We have them go through a lot of steps, and in some cases, it's quite arduous. I'm not going to lie, both for us and for the producer. But it's important that when we put our name on something, that there's transparency and authenticity, and that our customers know what they're getting. And so we've spent a lot of time building this out. And you mentioned the back label. We also have an iconographic system on our labels, right? So you can
Oh, cool.
see artisanal, environmentally sustainable, social responsibility, micro
Yeah.
production. And so we do that to also let consumers and trade know what's behind this wine. And I think that's important because when you're a consumer and you're going to a wine store and you're not sure where to begin, you pick up a bottle and you often turn it around and you're like, okay, let me read about it. So much information is potentially on a back label, but sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in shopping your values in whatever way, start with turning around the bottle and see if there's any information there. And over time, you can also ask your merchants or your trusted wine gurus about distributors or importers that share the same values as you. If it comes down to sustainability, as we're talking about, you can often find organic wines and biodynamic wines, which are in many forms very sustainable. As far as our selection process for the wine club goes, we talk about a different lens of values that are important to us as a company every month. So one month we talked about women winemakers, another month it was winemakers of color, another month it was organic wines, another month it was carbon neutral wines, and this last month it was kind of letting your hair down and natural ferments, because we're celebrating so much both newness and openness in the world. So we just thought it was appropriate to get a little natty.
Yeah, absolutely. And should we sample it? This is the Jovent wine. I'm gonna sample it. It's really good. What can you tell me a little bit more about, and our listeners a little bit more about the Jovent wine?
Sure. So it comes from a very small producer named Dasca Vives, run by a husband and wife team in Catalonia, which is close to the region. It contains Barcelona. They're about an hour away from Barcelona, and Dasca comes from Joseph Dasca and Vives Alba Vives. And Joseph's family had this property for a long time. And when he took over the property, he and Alba decided they wanted to convert it to be completely biodynamic. And so
Wow.
they spend a lot of time doing that. Now, what people might not understand or appreciate is to convert a land to biodynamic, it doesn't happen overnight, and it's actually very labor intensive. There are a lot of requirements, a lot of inputs to create the fertilizer, to create the preparations. It takes a lot of inputs to begin with. And so, what Joseph did was he actually started spearheading a community of other wineries to convert collectively biodynamic to biodynamics.
Wow.
And they're the most humble people too. They're incredible. So giving and salt of the earth. And they not only make wine, they also grow. They make cheese and they grow fruits and olive oils and nuts. And so they're seen as an integral part of the community. And it was through a lot of searching that I encountered them, and I feel like they're just this gem in our book. And the Hovent, particularly, is a younger wine. Hovent comes from the Spanish word joven, which means young. And generally, Spanish wines, if they're crianza or they're certain, they have different categories in Spanish wine vernacular, and they're often wooded. They often spend 6 months, 12 months in wood. Hoven is a or Hovent is the play on the concept that it's a young wine. It's meant to be enjoyed young, fresh. You're not going to want to age that wine forever. It's vibrant and alive, and so it's also biodynamic and organic and awesome. And I love the label too. It's very fun. It's speaking of letting
Beautiful.
your hair down, or it's more
Yes,
like letting your
I
hair
can
up.
see. It is beautiful, and forgive my mispronunciation. That is Jovent and not Jovent, but it tastes the same, regardless of how you say it.
And it
And
depends on the pronunciation. Sometimes I think the Catalonians might even call it Jovent.
so, speaking of that region, could you tell us? I know that you import wines from all over the world. Could you share with us the regions that you represent, and also maybe tell us one that we might not be familiar with?
Sure. So we started out in South Africa. We expanded to Brazil, Greece, Spain, Argentina, Uruguay, and now in the New York and New Jersey market, we also represent some very special wineries from California.
Wow, that's amazing. And is there a region that we might not know about
Definitely,
that you
one is in the
import?
box that you received. So Brazil is probably the most unique wine region, and people often ask why Brazil. And maybe 20 years ago, people probably asked why Argentina. And it only becomes obvious once the market gets behind it and it becomes more ubiquitous. And in the case of Brazil, they make in the south of Brazil, it's the same latitude where Argentina makes wine, where Uruguay makes wine. It's that sweet spot, actually around the world, where you're making wine in the southern hemisphere. And in this very south of Brazil, it has a very strong Italian influence. So
Hmm.
6, 7 generations ago, a lot of Italians came over on boats destined for the Americas. Some ended up in California, and some ended up in Brazil. And so a very strong Italian influence. And with that, they brought their viticulture experience and, in fact, their vines. So they've been creating wine, making wine mostly for local consumption. So in the 1970s, Moet, which is a well known international champagne house, got wind of the fact that high quality sparkling wine had the potential for being made in the south of Brazil. So they recruited a famous winemaker in Chile by the name of Mario Geiss to help them uh, start their Southern Hemisphere operation. Well, he was there for about a year, year and a half, and saw that they weren't really making high quality wine. They were doing what's called Charmat method, which is fine. And we enjoy a lot of Charmat wines out in the market, but he saw the potential for really going after um, very premium wines in the south of Brazil. And the reason why he saw that potential was because of the soil type and the elevation and the acidity that you get. So it's kind of all the right conditions for making high quality sparkling wines. So this was 40 years ago. He started his own winery, Cava Geiss or Familia Geiss. And the wine that we put in the wine club is probably one of our most unique wines. It's a non disgorged Method champenoise wine. So it's very similar. A lot of people could confuse it to a pet nat, but it actually has two fermentations, which I now I'm getting like super technical.
Oh, I love it.
But it's they are an incredible producer, and what's so special about them is that they have been spearheading also in their own way the entire category of wines from Brazil. So they're considered by, for example, Patricio Tapa, Latin America to be one of the premium and premier wine houses for sparkling wines.
I'm so excited to try it. And it says it's the 93 points. So it's obviously really high up there also in terms of premium wines. That is really interesting. I love hearing more about the stories of the winemakers. How many wines do you represent under your brand?
So right about now, probably around 100. We're
Wow.
growing. We are scaling a lot. I think the industry has started to truly appreciate, and consumers are starting to seek out wines that represent their values. And so, before it wasn't even something that was contemplated. You think you drink wine and it's you want to feel a certain way, you want to celebrate a moment, and sometimes we just forget to think about where things come from. And now that I think there's more intention behind what everyone's consuming all the time, there's an increasing appreciation for what we do. And so, in that way, we are continuing to grow our book.
That is wonderful. How do you select the winemakers that you work with?
Every country it's a little bit different, a little secret sauce mixed in, but they all have to embody the values that we represent. So we look often for, uh, at minimum, bare minimum, sustainable. We prefer organic and biodynamic. Many of our producers also use solar panels and so are reducing their carbon footprint. They're shipping in lighter bottles. We also obviously look at the social impacts, how our producers are working with their employees, um, the conditions with which they're provided, um, if there's an additional layer of social impact. So many of our producers also, in addition to embodying certain values of social impact, they also work in tandem with some nonprofits or some other elements. So we really look for producers um, that walk the walk. And we also, I personally, as a woman, and in the wine industry, which has been traditionally male driven, we always seek to support women winemakers, winemakers of color, and winemakers part of the LGBTQ community, winemakers, and decision makers who have had less um, participation historically. And we've been doing this since 2013. So it's been a very important part and foundational aspect of the business.
Such innovators in the wine industry. I love that you've been shaking up the system. Speaking of all this wine, what is your favorite wine of the season?
Ooh, wine of the season. I'm going to have to say right now it's going to be a pet nap. Petulant Natural, and from Dasca Vives, with the producer, we just got the new vintage in, and it is such a fun wine. I love Pet Nat. Its primary fermentation is happening. It's a single fermentation. So how do you make wine? You start with grapes and you add yeast, and the yeast eat the grape sugars and it converts it into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And often, in most winemaking environments for still wines, that carbon dioxide escapes. And we don't have carbonated wine. In the case of PetNat, all of that is happening. It's kind of a bit of art and math and science, um, where you're doing all of that within the bottle. So you have to kind of test it out just right so that you're not going to have an explosive wine. We've had some pet nats that just kind of explode, or that the sugar levels and the acidity levels are right. So it's one of the oldest ways. It's also called method ancestral. It's one of the oldest ways of making sparkling wine. And uh, what I love about the Dasca Viva's Pet Nat is that there's a bit of a tanginess and richness to it. So that's probably what I'm drinking more these days. I mean, there's so many good wines out there, so it's kind of catch me on a Tuesday at 5 p.m. and it's going to be a different answer than
Right.
Thursday at 1.
What is the most unique wine you've ever had?
The most unique wine, I would say it would have to be the Tinactorogos, the one that you are in love with.
Yes,
Uh,
that is so good. It is
it's
so good.
and that's by definition because it's the only one in the world.
Oh, wow.
So it's a varietal that was a Homeric from Homeric times. It was grown in ancient Greece. It was lost for a very long time. So Greek winemaking, until recently, was often done as field blends. So producers would have just a lot of different things. Like you might have wildflowers growing in your backyard. There would be wild varieties of grapes. And when we're talking about Greece, you have over 3,000 native grapes, right? So you don't
Wow.
necessarily know what's growing in your backyard. And what was commonplace for many years was producers would just vinify whatever's in their backyard and they'd call it a white wine. As modern winemaking started getting taking hold, and the Katima Brinsiki also took over from their families generally passed down over time. They took a look at what was in their backyard, and they hired an enologist to come in and say, "Hey, what's this?" And they found that one of their varieties was Tinactorogos, and it was lost. And so they, for the last 23 years, have exclusively been the only ones in the world growing this variety and
Wow.
rescuing it. And so that's why it's so unique, is because it's the only one.
Wow, it's unique and it's divine. Mika, this has been so fun. I am so glad that you joined me today. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedule, and thank you for all the work that you do, bringing thoughtful wines to wine fans like me who might not have the knowledge about it, but certainly have the desire to learn more. So, guys, you can learn more about Mika and Wine for the World at winefortheworld.com. It's with a number 4. And to learn more about the wine club, again, that's club.winefortheworld.com. Mika, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thank you for having me.